Athena inspires Nausicaa, the daughter of King Alcinous, to go with her handmaids to the river and wash clothes. Her father grants her permission, and she takes a wagon of clothes to be washed. As she waits for the clothes to dry, she and her handmaids have a picnic out by the river. With a little influence from Athena, Odysseus awakes to the sound of the girls playing with a ball. Odysseus emerges naked, covering himself with a leafy branch, a terrible sight, all crusted, caked with brine. All the women scatter, save Nausicaa, in whom Athena has planted courage. Odysseus tells the princess of his plight, and she welcomes him as a stranger sent from Zeus. To avoid scandal, Nausicaa instructs Odysseus on how to enter the city alone, find the queen, and grasp her knees. The book ends with Nausicaa leaving Odysseus in a sacred grove, and Odysseus praying to Athena.
Welcome to Ascend the Great Books podcast. I'm Adam Minihan. We're so glad that you are joining us today. Perhaps you are in love with Greek literature. Perhaps you are curious on how they actually did their laundry. Or perhaps you just want to have a friend like Athena who always has your back and making you look good. Regardless of why you're listening to the episode today, we are happy you're along. Here with Deacon Garlick, and we have a new guest with us this evening.
Yeah, we have Mr. Eli Stone with us. So Eli serves as the administrative assistant to the president of the Honors College, a great books college at the University of Tulsa here in our backyard. Eli also used to work for our Alcuin Institute here in the Diocese of Tulsa. We actually met when he was going through RCIA at Christ the King. I was a catechist and he came in. We have actually incredibly similar backgrounds, kind of a charismatic coming to the faith through the relationship of faith and reason. And so we clicked pretty early on. And he is also discerning religious life. So Eli, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's kind of great to be invited into this conversation. I've really enjoyed getting to read this book kind of off air with you guys. And yeah, we're just having a good time with it. So
yeah, we should mention that Eli is actually part of our Sunday Great Books group as well. Our men's group that comes together at my home where I try and demonstrate guest friendship to people. One time we talked about that I gave away a bunch of roosters one evening. That's been my most Greek friendship evening, but on the more mundane side, we have drinks and charcuterie boards and a lot of good laughs, and we read a text and we find wisdom. So Eli, before we get started, tell us a little bit about like how you fell in love with the great books.
So I went to college, and the first 2-3 years of my college experience, I didn't really have a lot of this exposure to this classical tradition, this great books tradition. My last semester of my junior year, I had the opportunity to read the medievals for the first time. And that was when I had the opportunity to see that they were drawing very heavily from an earlier culture, the Greeks, right? Aristotle and Plato and these thinkers. And so I was very unaware that there had just been this entire tradition that I just was never exposed to in my education. And so I really kind of took it upon myself over that summer between my junior and senior years to really dig in and better understand at least the philosophical portions. I was a kind of theology philosophy major in college. And so I kind of came into great books by way of philosophy. And after that, I had the opportunity to go back and kind of appreciate the literary aspects of a lot of these great books. And so that's kind of been my introduction to the great books. Obviously, I worked with the Alcuin Institute, as you mentioned, and now I'm working with the Honors College, which are both kind of great books-centered programs, have this appreciation for literature and this kind of integrated view of reflection on the human experience, I guess you could say.
Go ahead. What was the first, outside maybe Holy Scripture, what was the first great book that maybe just caught your attention?
So I read the Odyssey while I was in college, but I didn't appreciate it at all, actually. So I think
your first take of reading the Odyssey was not very a good experience?
I mean, I read it and I enjoyed it, but it was like I didn't see anything in it other than a fictional story, right? Like, and I saw it only for its value as entertainment, really. I did not see anything deeper than that.
Okay.
And I kind of read it because I had a wonderful Britannica edition that I'd found at my local thrift bookstore. And I was just like, oh, this is a beautiful like copy of this. And I've never read it. And everyone talks about how great it is. So I'll just read it. And I didn't have a guide. I didn't have, I hadn't been taught kind of how to read some of these things on a deeper level. And so I just read through it, and I kind of just read it like I would in, some kind of a, I don't know, Pulp Fiction novel or something. I just kind of read through it as I would any other fiction text, and I didn't think anything deeper of it. Exposure to great books that forced me to begin looking deeper or having a deeper appreciation for this. It was probably snippets of Aristotle's metaphysics. Because this was like how I was getting introduced to Aristotle by way of the medieval appropriation of his metaphysics. And so when the medievals are writing their theology books and their philosophy books, they're using Aristotle and Plato. But I also read Plato's Apology, and that was a very moving text. And I'm sure you'll discuss it at some point on this podcast. It's just incredibly moving. And,
I'll be like 43 by the time we actually get there.
Yeah, we're on the 20-year plan.
Yeah. Right, yeah. I mean, when you've got 800 years of, stuff to get through between here and then, right? There's a lot there. So yeah, I think most recently in my Great Books journey, one of the texts that I've really, I've actually really enjoyed reading through the Odyssey. This is my second time reading through the book. And it's just kind of like opened up in a new way for me. And I think it's because I had some exposure to some of those other earlier things. And I had a little bit more skills under my belt to really appreciate the gems that were in the texts. I
think that a lot of people ask me, like online or on Twitter, X or whatever we're supposed to be calling it, they'll ask me like, do you have a good commentary on the Odyssey? Well, now I do, because we have a guide that you can go to thegreatbookspodcast.com and look at. But in a lot of ways, outside of that, it's amazing to me how much you just dive into a text on your second or third read.
Mm-hmm. I think, yeah. I mean, you have to, and this is something, they teach you in Comp 1, right? Like, in order to read a text properly, you should skim it first, and then you should reread it. It's just like, I don't know. I didn't have the context to appreciate that, but I think you're right. There is
there's a benefit to tracking the narrative. Like, first time you read it, you have to track the narrative, like just who are the characters, what are they saying, what's the proper storyline, the literal reading of the book. And then once you get the literal reading of the book, then you can go back through and pick up more on some of the non-surface level, kind of deeper dive into the allegorical or the anagogical or the moral aspects of the different types of reading that you can do from the storyline. So reading through this for the first time, as people have seen, like, I'm still trying to just track the story. Like, okay, who's this guy? Who's this character? Like, what's the beginning of this person or this god or goddess? So I think this is such a benefit of being able to talk about these type of books with a group of people, right? It's been a huge benefit for me talking to Deacon Garlick and all of our guests, including you, Eli, because I'm tracking it for the first time, and by discussing it as a group, you're able to come up with a lot more insights than what you would just on your own. Just similar to how you gave us your understanding of the first time you read it, right? The first time you read it, you just read it as a regular fiction book, right? But now that you're in the Great Books, our Sunday Great Books Club, and you're really kind of sinking your teeth into it, there's probably a lot more that has jumped out to you this go around than the first go around, I would assume.
Yeah, and I mean, in my case, it's helpful too. I have a little bit more context, like drawing from commentaries and what other people have to say about it is a huge boon. There's in the recent years, there's been a lot more of an interest in the great books, and so there's all these great podcasts that are coming out, of which yours is one, right? And there's all of these resources that were available to me that I had no idea existed. And so,
Sure.
Yeah, a plethora of mentors to guide us through.
Pretty good.
Yeah.
Pretty good.
Well, let's jump into book 6 and try to figure out how they actually do laundry.
Yeah, so this is the first time I read the Odyssey, as I've mentioned, I really struggled all the way up to book 9 in a lot of different ways. I mean, finally in book 5 we finally find Odysseus. I was like, thank God, I don't care who Telemachus is. Like, finally, get me to Odysseus. I did not have appreciation for Telemachus' coming of age story, which is something I've already kind of articulated here on the podcast. But honestly, like, if I'm going to play some of my cards, and maybe, Eli, you can be our mentor, you can be our guiding light out of the cave, I still struggle to have an appreciation for book 6. Even when
really?
I know. Okay, this is why. Okay, so see, your like reaction that you just had. This is why I invited you on the podcast, because I noticed in the Sunday Great Books group where I'm kind of struggling to kind of, I'm seeing broad parallels, etc., but it's not really coming alive to me like a lot of the other books in the Odyssey are. I noticed that a lot of this came alive for you, and so obviously we have a very robust understanding of Homer as a teacher. So I'm very skeptical that if I'm not clicking well with the text, my gut reaction there is not to say, well, this is an idiotic chapter that Homer put in, like, this is dumb, he's boring, but rather, like, because I see him as the teacher, I'm clearly missing something. And so I look forward to you illuminating and shedding light on the darkness of my ignorance as we move through this text. So let's start. So book 6, we're going to be working through the Fagles translation as always. So we get Nausicaa, the princess, and Athena comes to her through a dream and tells her, listen, you need to go do laundry. You need to go wash your clothes down by the river. And obviously Athena is setting this up because she's orchestrating this meeting between Nausicaa and Odysseus, who is off sleeping underneath the olive tree bushes, if I recall correctly. And so Nausicaa, then we have this interesting narrative where she turns to her father to ask permission to do this. And, she talks about, like, well, I have my clothes, I have my brother's clothes. She has to, like, really, like, human nature is still the same. Like, I love this. Right at the end, this is, like, line 70. She's like, you have 5 sons. They're full grown in the palace. 2 of them are married, but the 3 are lusty bachelors, always demanding crisp shirts fresh from the wash when they go out and dance. Right? Like,
these jocks are out there playing all their sports and they're soiling all their laundry, and now I got to go and wash it.
And apparently, I'm not entirely sure about this, but, for Nausicaa and her island here, dancing is a big deal. Well, we'll see that later, right? Dancing, like, they pride themselves on their dancing, and their dancing is almost akin to, like, gymnastics or something, right? It's an athletic display. So anyway, she has to do all this. Anyone note anything of this passage that you want to point out?
I just read it for the first time as, like, Athena kind of coming to her and be like, hey, get your life together. Like, get it together. Like, you have a lot of things, a lot of chores to be doing. You have a lot of things that you're supposed to be doing. Like, look at all this laundry. I don't know. And this is probably just like my dadness coming out of me. Like, I walk in and it's like, son, daughter, like, look at your room. Get your act together. Do you want to be a grown man? Do you want to be a grown woman? Like, you got to do the little things first. Like, get your stuff together. And, before you can do bigger things. I don't know, that's just kind of how I read it the first time.
Well, to be fair to that interpretation, in line like 27 or 28, I mean, Athena opens this with, Nausicaa, how could your mother bear a careless girl like you? So it's like, yeah, very, very, very harsh. Now, I think it's interesting, we've seen this several times where, the goddess takes the form of someone that is familiar to the individual. There's a question like, is this a kind of way that Homer is talking about the gods inspiring these people? In this case, it's in a dream, and so, it's a little bit easier. But in the case with Mentor, right? Mentor himself was still in Ithaca while he was guiding, or Athena was guiding Telemachus and Mentor's guys. And so this aspect of the gods appearing as someone familiar to them, I think there's an adaptation of language, right? It wouldn't be believable if the god appeared as someone and then acted very kindly toward them if that person they're acting as wouldn't have acted kindly toward them. So maybe it's not Athena coming out and being mean because Athena's mean, but maybe this person that she chose to appear to.
She's taking on the persona along with the appearance.
But I do want to draw something else out that Athena mentions, right? Right after where we just stopped there, in line 29, look at your fine clothes lying here neglected, with your marriage not far off. The day you should be decked in all your glory and offer elegant dress to those who form your escort. And that's how a bride's good name goes out across the world. It brings her father and queenly mother joy. Come, let's go wash these clothes at break of day. So this is the motive, you might say, for Nausicaa's going to wash the laundry. It's her real motive. It's, I'm going to go and do this to prepare for my wedding. I'm going to go and do this laundry and prepare my wedding dress. And it doesn't seem like she has a particular suitor yet. But in a society where marriages are arranged, that's not a problem. Like, her father's going to be taking care of that for her soon. But then what strikes me about this passage is in line 61, she addresses her father. And she says, "Daddy dear," and so there's this very intimate expression here. "Daddy, I wonder, won't you have them harness a wagon for me, the tall one with the good smooth wheels, so I can take our clothes to the river for a washing? Lovely things, but lying before me all soiled. And you yourself sitting among the princes, debating points at your council, you really should be wearing spotless linen. Then you have 5 sons, full grown in the palace, 2 of them married, but 3 are lusty bachelors, always demanding the crisp shirts fresh from the wash when they go out to dance. Look at my duties, all that rests on me." And then Homer kind of interludes with more context here. "So she coaxed, too shy to touch on her hopes for marriage, young, warm hopes in her father's presence." So what are your thoughts on this? So Nausicaa wants to do this because she wants to get married. She wants to go down and wash and prepare for her marriage, right? This is her reason, her motive for doing this. But she doesn't bring this up at all to her father. She gives every other excuse. You need clean clothes because you're the king and you've got to have your big fancy meetings. And you've got all of these sons, my brothers, who need clean laundry when they go out and do their gymnastics. And I mean, Adam, maybe this is a good question for you on this first read through. How do you read this?
Well,
like, what is this?
I read it as a dad who, my daughter is always wanting something and knows that if she can make it appear to be I'm helping other people in the process and it's not my own motives, then you're going to be more apt or willing to let me have the thing that I want. So to me, I just read this as she's sitting here saying, like, I'd like to have this wagon because it'd things a lot easier. But if I just ask him for that, he'll know that I've been slacking off. So what I'll do is say, here's all the things that I need help to help the family out. And in order to do that, I need the keys to the car. That was my read.
That's good. I didn't think about the keys to the car when I read this, but I think that's a good read. What I would like to throw out is this, and I don't want to answer the question. I want to throw it out as a thesis or a concern at the beginning of the book and see how it plays out. And I'm not entirely sure we even get to an answer until book 7, if we do get an answer. But like the first time I read this, it did not capture my attention. I just kind of burned through it. I noticed some of the parallels and I moved on. This time when I read it, I think the main question that I bring to book 6 is I read Nausicaa. I read her heavily coming off the Calypso narrative. So we just got Odysseus off of Calypso's island. Obviously he had this little, like you said, this little interlude out in the waters where his rafts bashed around, etc. He meets Ino. But it's really the Calypso temptation to immortality, which we have discussed. We discussed it in Sunday Great Books, our little small group we talked about on the podcast, that I think the best way to look at her offer and Odysseus's rejection of it is that she's really offering him something unnatural to man. This immortality, trying to graft it onto our human nature, is something that is unnatural to us. And Tithonus, right, the Dawn's husband that gets eternal life but not eternal youth, and then shrivels up into this horrid creature, is that kind of mythic warning of that. So as I read it, and all of a sudden we're introduced to like this young, beautiful princess who now marriage has already been thrown out twice in the beginning of the text, my immediate thought is in juxtaposition to Eclipso, which is basically, is this going to be another temptation for Odysseus? And is this going to be, I would argue, a more dangerous one because it's a more natural temptation, right? It's this mortal love. And so that's, I don't think we can answer that right now, but when I saw the stuff about marriage, I saw the stuff about young women, I saw Athena setting up this meeting, that's what my mind goes to, is that, oh, we're going to have this, here's another island, we're going to have another temptation for Odysseus.
Well, let's do this then. Let's continue reading that passage, because I really like what you said there, and I think that you're onto something. So she asks her father, she says, hey, let me go and do the laundry, give me the keys to the car, so I can go and do everyone else's laundry. She doesn't mention her own. So here, kind of at line 75, 76, so she coaxed, too shy to touch on her hopes for marriage, young warm hopes in her father's presence. But he saw through it all and answered quickly, I won't deny you the mules, my darling girl. I won't deny you anything. Off you go, and the men will harness a wagon, the tall one with the good smooth wheels, fitted out with a cradle on the top. So this exchange, I think, sets up something very interesting that I think we'll see throughout the rest of this book. And that is an inkling, or I guess you could say, a sense of what the purpose of rhetoric in Greek culture is. So notice what happens when Nausicaa wants to approach her father and ask him to let her go and do laundry for her upcoming marriage. She doesn't come out and say it, Dad, I want to go and do the laundry to prepare for my marriage. And why would she maybe not want to do that? Well, maybe because it would be improper for a girl to ask her father, hey, hurry up this process and get me married. Maybe it would just be impolite to do this in the company of her father, because she interrupts some kind of other meeting that her father's having. She comes up to him. So why would she come out and brashly kind of say this? Well, she shouldn't. It's inappropriate for her to bring it up at this time. It's inappropriate for her to bring it up in this way. So what does she do? She is able to ask what she wants to ask without having to ask it. And I think that to Greek culture, rhetoric is highly prized. And this is the same in Roman culture, right? But I think we don't understand or have an appreciation of rhetoric as much, because for us, I think we tend to value as a culture honesty and authenticity a little bit more than kind of this, well, I'm going to say one thing but mean something completely different. But here I think it's a sign of civilization. It's a sign of civilization to be able to say something to someone in a way that is not going to embarrass them. It's not going to put them off. It's not going to inform anyone who may be overhearing what is being said and clue them in on something that they shouldn't be clued in on. There's a lot of advantages to this. And I think for Homer's imagination, it is the pinnacle, or it's indicative of a very affluent and highly evolved society to have skills in rhetoric, or to have these rulers who are skilled in rhetoric. So what happens when Nausicaa makes her request to her dad that she doesn't actually ask? She says, Dad, help me go and do everyone else's laundry, but secretly she wants to do her own because she wants to be married. What does her father say? Homer says her father sees through it all. But then her father goes on to respond. He says, I won't deny you the mules, my darling girl. I won't deny you anything. Why does he include saying, I won't deny you anything? It's because this is his way of reassuring his daughter, I know what you're asking for. Do I have someone in mind for you? Are you going to get married soon? I know that this is a big question. This is something you're like excited for. I understand where you're coming from. I'm not going to deny you anything. This is already on my mind. Go and do what you need to do. And so he is able to answer her question without answering it directly because she hasn't approached him with that question directly. And so they're able to have a private conversation, father to daughter, daughter to father, and a very vulnerable conversation. This is like she is preparing to enter this next season of her life, and she's afraid that her father may be overlooking her. But he is able to reassure her in the context of other people in a way that only she could understand and won't embarrass her in front of anyone else, just as she didn't embarrass him in front of anyone else.
No, I think your point on rhetoric is well taken. I think it's a constant motif throughout all of the Odyssey because our main protagonist is Odysseus, right, who is this master of rhetoric. And so I think that, we see a lot of these little narratives of rhetoric, I think, kind of orbiting around him and giving almost different examples of rhetoric. I like what you say about the relationship between the father and the daughter, because I think in any close relationship, whether it's a parent to child or you get two good friends together, we've all been there where you watch two people interact with one another and you realize what they said, but then you realize a lot more just transpired between them than what was actually said aloud, but they just completely jive with one another, right? Whether it's wit or banter or kind of in this, I think, more intimate, playful back and forth where the daughter is shy and the father actually can see through it. I mean, we've all seen that. And I think that it's encapsulating it here in the Odyssey is a certain brilliance of Homer. And it's something that I think should illuminate for us as we move through the text, all these little different examples of rhetoric, particularly with Odysseus. Now, I don't find all of his as intimate and warming as this one, but I think that's very good. Let's
Well, and the reason I bring it up is because I think this sets the stage for Nausicaa's conversation that she has with Odysseus after he wakes up. And to your point, I think this demonstrates that Nausicaa and her father, they're part of a civilization that is kind of comparable to Odysseus' own in Ithaca, right? But that means that Nausicaa, in her rhetorical skills, will pose a temptation for Odysseus because, remember Penelope. Penelope is someone who is also highly skilled at rhetoric. She is also very crafty. She has a sort of excellence that is attractive for Odysseus. And so Nausicaa is, maybe we could say, being cast as a young Penelope here, someone who is of the marriageable age, someone who is very deferential and would make a wonderful wife by the wonderful image we're given of her in this just interaction with her father. I think it speaks volumes of her character in general. And then, as we'll see, she has this rhetorical skill. And that rhetorical skill can only come from someone who has the craftiness or the eloquence or the excellence, the virtue that we've seen that Penelope has. And so I think to your point about a temptation for Odysseus, I think we will see that Nausicaa is probably a temptation for Odysseus in that regard.
No, I think the young Penelope analogy is incredibly apt. And it's one that really stood out to me because as I did this read through and paying more attention to Telemachus's narrative, what that meant is I also paid more attention to Penelope's narrative, right? What she was called the matchless queen of cunning, right? And I think that when we compared her, I think your comments are spot on because when we looked at her in comparison to Calypso, that's again where you get a moment of this Odyssean rhetoric, right? If you remember that back and forth where Calypso is, saying, I'm the immortal. Am I not more beautiful? Why would you want to go back to this mortal? And he calls her wise Penelope. And of course, immortal, you are more beautiful than she is. But he never closes the rhetorical loop, right? He never actually says what it is about Penelope, but he leaves out, this kind of hook of, well, it's wise Penelope, right? There's a certain intelligence that she has, and they really do mirror each other, right? She's the matchless queen of cunning. He's the mastermind like Zeus. And no, I think you're spot on, which is why I was very worried, and I guess am worried as we work through this text, that she is a more fatal temptation to him than Calypso is. She's the more natural, not only a natural temptation, but she also reminds him of his wife. And keep in mind, he doesn't even know if his wife is alive. He's
been gone for 20 years, 18 years at this point. Like it's been a long time. Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's push forward the narrative a little bit, and then we'll parse out things that we see. So they go down around like 100 and moving on to 110. They're going down. They're going to wash the clothes. They're bathing. They're having a picnic. They're playing a game. We get a few things that I'm just going to point out here about Nausicaa. She's compared. Artemis is mentioned. I think that's important, and we'll see why. We also get the reiteration that she's a virgin and still unwed. So there we're kind of watching our marriage theme. So then Athena, sets up this kind of awakening, right, where they play with a ball. The girls are playing with a ball, and it splashes, and it wakes up Odysseus, right? So she orchestrates this. And I think the rhetoric that we get coming out of Odysseus here, I think is incredibly important. So this is about 130. And again, we have something that I think seems very common to us as moderns, but I think is somewhat unique in this, in which Odysseus is addressing himself, right? It's not the narrator telling us about Odysseus. Odysseus is actually addressing himself. And we saw this, I think, 3 times when he was in the ocean and having that narrative of being, battered by the storms of Poseidon. He speaks, it's very explicit that he speaks to his spirit, right? He speaks to his thumos, right? He speaks to himself. And this is very similar to that. We get this narrative, right? Man of misery, whose land have I lit on now? And I think his comment here, this juxtaposition, gives a lot of structure to this book. What are they here? Violent, savage, lawless, or friendly to strangers, God-fearing men? When we read this, I think a safe takeaway here is that guest friendship really is the sign of civilization. Right? That's what he says. Friendly to strangers, right? He's comparing this to the savage and the lawless. Are they friendly to strangers? Are they God-fearing men? This guest friendship, I think, is a point of civilization. And he ends this interior monologue with up with you. This thing about courage. We've talked about the spirit, right? The thumos, it's what seeks glory. It's what seeks honor. It's what Telemachus, in a lot of ways, is leaving Ithaca to go find, right? To become a man. He has to find that thumos. And so at the end line here, around 138 or so, we get that noticeable courage. You need to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps here. Up with you. See how the land lies. See for yourself.
Yeah, I think to your point about the thumos, right? This is the thing that animates man, right? Like this is in the Iliad, right? Like this is the thing that leaves the body on the battlefield, right? When a warrior is speared in the gut, as he bleeds, like this is what is exiting his body, is his thumos, his fighting spirit, this thing that animates him. And so yeah, I mean, he's been battered, he's been beat down, he's been bruised, and so he has to kind of rouse that. Like I think, we've all had a hard time waking up one day. You just wake up at like noon and you're like, what year is it? And it's like, okay, I gotta force myself to get out of bed here. Odysseus probably has.
Who among us have not woken up naked in the bushes and had to talk to ourselves and say, up with you.
Yeah.
There's girls playing with a ball over there.
Is this something you've experienced in your hunting journeys, Deacon? Like this isn't like, have you ever been just like
what happened?
Raggled in a bush? Like, man, that boar, like I just,
I mean, I wasn't naked, but, I don't think we need to have any kind of great, confessions on the podcast here, but, you have had those moments on, last year I was hunting, and I was hunting out in, just the prairie. I mean, you see the deer at 400 or 500 yards, and then you've got to move it. I actually had a moment just like this where I saw a deer at 400 yards and realized I needed to be 200 yards in a different position if I even wanted a chance. And to run 200 yards over the prairie while you're holding a tripod, your rifle, and a pack, and you don't want to stand straight up because then you're very noticeable, so you're going to basically crouch and run. Yeah, there was a lot of, I would say, self-motivation that had to actually occur. There was a lot of me speaking to my thumos, maybe criticizing myself for my lack of athleticism and not preparing enough of what it was then to run these 200 yards with all this gear, as I'm trying to stay close to the ground. So, not naked in the bushes, but, we've all had those kind of...
You're over encumbered in the bush.
Yeah.
You had the opposite problem.
You wake up and you see your prize and you got to go do something. So, speaking of hunting, so let's take this as our segue, because I found this fascinating. So 140. So Odysseus is creeping out of the bushes. He's going to take a leafy branch and he's going to cover his nakedness. But then we get this, I love these Homeric metaphors, right? These similes that are going to go on for lines and lines and lines. But this one I think is worth noting. Odysseus, right? He stalked out as a mountain lion, exultant in his power, strides through the wind and rain, his eyes blaze, and he charges sheep or oxen or chases wild deer. But his hunger drives him on to go for flocks, even to raid the best defended homesteads. So Odysseus moved out, about to mingle with all those lovely girls.
Okay, so I wanted to see what you guys' thoughts were there, because as I was listening to you with this internal monologue and all those things, like as I was reading this, I read it as Odysseus wakes up very confused, like trying to figure out what's going on. He hears noises. He doesn't know who it is, if it's a god or if it's men. And then he hears women. He's like, okay, is it a nymph or is it women? Are these women even friendly? Like, can these be women that I don't even know about that could tear my face off? Like I don't know anything about these women. But then he has this courage. It's up with you, like go. And then he does, and he covers himself. He does the things that he's very prudent in the things that he has to take care of. He stalks them, and then he sees that they're girls. And the first thing he does is Odysseus, who is very good with words, as we were just talking about, he basically butters Nausicaa up, like to the point of like, I'm not sure like exactly who you are, what's going on, but are you a goddess or you're immortal? You're so beautiful. I don't know. Like I can't even distinguish between the two.
Some good flattery to use. Next time you get the chance. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think obviously he's playing cards here, right? Or at least it seems to me he's playing cards. He's playing a chess game, trying to figure out what his next move is.
I think one of the important things about this passage in particular, so where are they? So we kind of glossed over this. They're at the mouth of a river, which means they're near the sea coast. And that's not a safe place for women to be in the ancient world, because piracy is a huge issue. And notice they don't have any retainers with them. There are no men with these young women. They haven't been escorted. And this is probably, because, as we'll later discover in this book and in the next book, this is a very peaceful society in general. But, Odysseus doesn't know this now. And so he's kind of like, well, I need to be prepared for anything. And he struts out like kind of in this, makes himself look a little bit taller and, knows what he's doing, just kind of commands himself. But for these women, they are not safe, like at all. And I think this language about, Odysseus striving out like a mountain lion, driven on by his hunger, I think this should tickle some things to an audience that knows what happened at Troy, which is namely that after the sack of Troy, there was this terrible raping and pillage of Troy. And that kind of rapacious sort of language, I think Homer is driving here, is meant to make us question, like, oh no, what's about to happen? Like this could go very wrong. Like this could not be a good story at all. And in Odysseus's case, right, this isn't Odysseus's intention. But for the women, what's the first thing they do as soon as they see Odysseus? They just book it. They hightail it out of there.
Well, we find out that they don't get a lot of guests, right? So they're probably not used to it either.
That's true. But especially if you have a stranger who is naked and looking very like powerful, and he is a warrior. He's got this stately build and he's just striding towards them like, okay, When you're not used to having strangers, that's going to be especially concerning.
Yeah, I don't think their reaction, I mean, right, we're actually explicitly told Athena has to place courage in Nausicaa's heart for her to stay. Their reaction seems normative to me. I I didn't think about the Trojan women parallel there. I think where my thoughts parallel yours, Eli, is simply that, I'm already concerned about this becoming another temptation for Odysseus. And now we've got these lovely women out. They've been bathing. They're playing a picnic. We've got the beautiful princess. And Homer decides to use this incredibly predatory language for Odysseus coming out of the bushes. And I think it sets a certain tone. Now, we can shift into his rhetoric, because then I think there's a certain juxtaposition between the predatory metaphor that that Homer just gave us, and then kind of the certain guardedness and I think someone mentioned his rhetoric was like a chess match. I think it was you, Adam, that there's a chess going on that seems much more complex than the mountain lion coming out for prey, right? Mm-hmm. But when I first just read just that passage, I was like, yep, this is the temptation scene. Like we got all these beautiful women. So let me just hit some high points on Odysseus' speech, because I think there's a lot here. So let me kind of just point this out and then see your takes on it. So the first thing I'd point out is one. So this is Odysseus, speaking to Nausicaa. He tells her that you're like Artemis come to life. This is our second Artemis reference very quickly. I think anytime we see the gods referenced, you have both the god themselves, and you also kind of have, I don't want to say their patronage, but what do they stand for, right? Either allegorically or not. And so Artemis is, one of the virgin goddesses, right? And I think there's a lot of comparisons there to her. And then we do get the flattery. Adam, you mentioned this. I mean, it's thick, right? I've never laid eyes on anyone like you, neither man nor woman, which is an interesting phrase. I look at you, a sense of wonder takes me. I'm just saying, when I've complimented, my wife in the past, I don't be like, babe, you look better than any woman or man I have ever seen. Yeah. But again, I'm nascent in my rhetoric. I could always add that into my repertoire.
Let me know how it goes whenever you do. I'd be very
I'll report
interested.
Back to the podcast when I'm also looking for a place to live. So now he also mentions then Apollo's altar. He gives this kind of side note, and the first time I read this, I was like, wait, why is he doing this? And then he talks to her about, like, I would grasp you by the knees, but I'm not going to. And the way I took this is that, he sees these women, but I'm not entirely sure he's convinced yet that they're not savages or lawless, right? He sees they're women. And so I took this very much as this is a guarded speech, and his mentioning of Artemis, his mentioning of Apollo, and his mentioning of the custom of grabbing by the knees, I think that he even, and then it ends kind of with, I think, what would be the typical stranger's plea for guest friendship. When you get these little touch points, I took these as touch points of civilization. I think you used that word earlier, Eli. I took these as like, okay, he's throwing out these little touch points, like Artemis, like Apollo, or I would grab you by the knees. These are things that a civilized culture would understand, and I think he's gauging her reaction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Adam, what was your reaction to this speech that Odysseus gives, like, to Nausicaa, as a first-time reader, like, as you're reading this, like?
Well, I think kind of like what Deacon was saying is that I felt like it was a test to see how much she actually knew what he was talking about, right? So he's like, it's almost like when you're playing spades and you open up and you're like, hey, I'm giving you a two of clubs, knowing that I have the king of clubs, so I want to see if you know how to play this game. And so, I mean, that's just kind of maybe the surface level take that I had on it.
No, I think there's certainly elements of that in this, right? Because as you mentioned, Deacon, Odysseus has no base point. He has no way of knowing whether this civilization is cultured or not. And so I think you're correct. I think he does try to test Nausicaa here. But I think coming especially off of the very strong predatory language, Odysseus's choice of comparing Nausicaa to Artemis is very, very carefully chosen. Notice Odysseus is thinking off his feet. He doesn't know what he's going to encounter out there. He strides out of the bushes. He sees these young girls, and they're all probably not fully clothed, like they've been playing in the water. All of the clothes are laying out to dry. He's also not clothed, and he just realizes, oh, this doesn't look good on me at all. And I need to have some way to plead for the guest friendship I need, while also making these girls feel entirely safe and also showing them how cultured I am. And so I think, to your point, I think he tries to offer these touch points of civilization. But I think to another point, he is trying his best to... So why does he choose Artemis? Well, Artemis is, like you said, a virgin goddess. She's the goddess of the hunt. But she's not just any other virgin goddess in the sense that no one has ever tried to pursue her. She is a virgin goddess in the sense that anyone who has ever tried to sexually approach her, even inadvertently, has died a miserable and painful death. Out most people's imaginations is there's this man, he's going on a hunting journey. He's got his hounds with him, he's got his horses with him, and he's got his friends with him, but he strays a little farther into the grove and he sees Artemis bathing. And Artemis curses him and transforms him into game, so that then when he runs back out of the bushes, his hounds tear him apart, even though he realizes exactly what's happened to him and he feels everything. And so it's this gruesome, gruesome death that he faces. And so by choosing Artemis and opening with, "Are you a goddess? You look like Artemis," what he's saying to Nausicaa is, I'm not going to rape you. No man in their right mind would ever dream of approaching you. But if he had said that, if he had said, just come out and said, I'm just not going to rape you here, I just want you to know that, like, would you trust that? Especially coming from a stranger? It'd be very awkward, right? Because then it's like, that's red flags, right? So if he just comes out and says what he wants to say, it's not going to be received well. So what does he have to do?
That's a deep dive. That's a deep dive on the Artemis. I like that, and that allegory, not only her being the virgin goddess, but also her mythology behind that. And then, I mean, isn't this though the natural coupling that in trying to test and see where her touch points are for civilization, whether or not she's lawless, in doing so, he shows that he is civilized.
No, right? I think it's a both and. I certainly think it's a both and. But I do think that, he could have pulled Apollo out of a hat. He could have pulled Athena out of a hat. He could have pulled anyone out of a hat, but he's chosen Artemis. And he's chosen Artemis for a very particular reason.
Yeah, it was intentional.
No, and then he also mentions too, actually, in connection with Apollo, he talks about this tree, this beautiful tree he saw by Apollo's shrine. And he says, I stood there gazing, rapt, for hours, just looking at the beauty of this tree, and that's why I'm not at your knees, clasping your knees. So he gives himself a trumped up, but also convenient excuse to not do the standard ritual, because he wants her to feel safe throughout this entire exchange. So again,
go ahead.
Just again, I think this touch point of rhetoric, what is rhetoric? It is saying what needs to be said without saying it, or saying what needs to be said in a way that the audience will be able to receive it. And I think this is just a masterful example of Odysseus walking into a situation that he wasn't prepared for, realizing that he was in a very bad light, like he is at a disadvantage. He has to choose his words very carefully, and he does, and he pulls it off, and he has this kind of charm, this mind that is able to draw all of these touch points of culture to guest for her, and showing himself to be civilized and showing himself not to be a threat to her in this particular situation, even as bad as it looks.
What do you think the role though of the flattery is? Like, do we take that, right? So when he goes and he says, this is like 78 or so, right? I've never laid eyes on anyone like you, either man nor woman, right? So this is what Adam was mentioning, that there's this heavy dose of flattery, which I think, obviously on a human level, he's I think what you say earlier, buttering her up, right, to this request as a stranger to the host. But I was curious though, like with this Odyssean rhetoric, you just can't ever take him on face value. And I wonder if this really reflects his interior disposition. Like, do we think this actually reflects some type of interior disposition? And then if it's so, I'm going to lean more towards the problem of this being a real temptation for him. Or is this just simply, this is the master of rhetoric coming out to have an effect on his hearer, right, on his listener?
I mean, I think it's fascinating because he says at the very beginning, "You look like a goddess. Are you a goddess? I can't tell." But then he closes his speech with some very interesting words. So jumping ahead a little bit further, right, he begs her for her compassion. He says, "Compassion, princess, please." This is, probably about 210, 213-ish. "You are the first I have come to. No one else, none in your city, no one in your land. Show me the way to town." He's begging her for this guest friendship, this assistant. This is funny to me. He says, "Give me a rag for cover, just some cloth, some wrapper you may have carried with you here." Like, he sees all the laundry on the beach. He knows exactly, like, he knows they have what he wants, but he puts it in a way that's, if it's not a trouble, if you happen to have something, just give me some kind of rag. I don't need much. But then he says this, "May the good gods give you all your heart desires, husband and house and lasting harmony too." So why would he say this? It's because he knows exactly what the situation is. So he opens with saying, "You're a goddess. I can't tell if you're mortal or immortal." But he ends with, "I know exactly what's going on. You're doing laundry. You're of a marriageable age. You've got all your handmaids with you. You're a princess. I can surmise that. You seem educated. I know exactly what's going on here. May the gods give you these things that you're seeking." And that tells me that Odysseus knows this isn't a goddess. He knows that Nausicaa is a princess and that she is approaching the age of her marriage. But he doesn't open with this. He lets the cat out of the bag. Like, this is a theatrical performance, right? He waxes eloquent, like, "You look like a god. You look like Artemis," which carries all of the subtext of, "You're entirely safe. I'm not thinking about what you think I might be thinking about." Then he goes on to talk about Apollo, which shows that he's well-traveled and that he knows of this pantheon of gods, not just his regional god, right? Or these horror stories that have been passing around. He shows that he's eloquent and that he is concerned and that he is downtrodden, that he's had this hardship and that he's a stranger in their land seeking hospitality. And he gives himself an excuse for not rushing up to hug her knees because he's like, "I am so in awe of your beauty." But at the end of all of it, the kind of mask comes off and he says, "And by the way, I've known the whole time, you're not a goddess. You're someone who is waiting for your husband. And I just need shown the way to the town. May the good gods bless you in this, right? For your hospitality." So it's kind of like, I see this as a beautifully crafted, and again, on the spot, appropriation of everything he knows that she is anxious about and anxious for, and using this to craft his petition in a way that she's going to be receptive to and not feel threatened by. And I think he does a masterful job of it. And I think this is part of the reason I find this book so charming, not only because of Nausicaa's character, because she has some beautiful responses to him and has some of her own rhetorical flourish that she provides. But Odysseus here, I think we see in full display, as opposed to how we saw him in the last chapter, or I guess a few books ago, right? Where he's on the beach crying, a shell of his former self. This is Odysseus in all of his glory.
Yeah, that's interesting because that that tracks well with when Frank, Dr. Grabowski, was here. That was one of the things that he really mentioned, was particularly if you look back at book 5, that there's a maturation for Odysseus as well. They go from crying on the beach to him trusting his own judgment, him looking at his thumos, those kind of 3 touch points that we talked about earlier. So I do like that we're seeing an arc of Odysseus come, and now maybe his rhetoric is now firing again on all cylinders, and he can, just step out of the bushes, start going immediately with what needs to be said, even if it's implied, and by the end of his speech, he, can surmise the actual situation before him, right? I mean, that seems to be the Odysseus that we know, as opposed to the guy that we were introduced to, which was the guy crying on the beach, right? What do we make, though, of the clothing? So it occurs to me just, obviously that one of the reasons that Athena aspired her to do this was simply to bring clothes, because we know Odysseus is going to need male clothes, and so she needs to get the princess down by the water somehow with clothes that Odysseus can wear. But then it also occurs to me that clothing has been a theme, right? So Calypso gave him clothing, and it almost drowned him. And then Ino gives him her scarf, and that saves him to some extent. I think my best understanding of that is that it might have been what allowed Poseidon to relent in his rage, which allowed him to even approach the island. And now we get clothing again. I'm not sure. Is there a motif here?
I do not know. If you're asking me, I'm not sure. That's a good question.
I think there's a connection maybe back to Penelope as well, right? What is she doing? She's weaving this burial shroud for her father, right? So there's, and Athena is the patron of textile arts, arts in general, right? Like not just strategic warfare, but excuse me. In particular, weaving is a thing that Athena is known for, and she does, right? And so it's like, I feel like there's a connection here, right? Back to Penelope, and I think you're right. Maybe there is this theme of clothing. I also just think it's part of that basic hospitality, right? Because
if your guest is naked, you should probably give him some.
You should
clothing.
probably clothe him.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Like that's it's just a little bit of hospitality.
Well, let's talk about.
We see this with Telemachus, right? When Telemachus goes to visit Nestor clothes him in his son's robes, I believe. And so this idea of sharing clothing or receiving clothing as a gift for being a guest, I don't think is uncommon in this culture.
No, it's not. And I think that's a good segue into, what happens to Telemachus before he gets the clothing. He gets bathed by Nestor's youngest daughter, if I remember correctly, right? This is a custom that we see. And so let's push this narrative forward just a little bit, because I think the bathing scene is something to unpack. We do get Nausicaa's original response back to Odysseus, which I think that what I read in this is that, Nausicaa, as you've already mentioned, Eli, she has wit. She's a clever girl. She also very clearly shows that she has that touch point of civilization on guest friendship. She also knows the gods, right? She's very clearly also weaving a strong rhetorical response to him. And there's a few things that stood out to me. One is that she gets a comment on fate. And I think this is one of the questions that we've been asking ourselves throughout the Odyssey, mainly because we also asked ourselves throughout the entire Iliad. Like, what is the relationship between man and his free will and the gods? And there's side questions too about even the gods and fate, and how much can you actually extricate, say, Zeus from fate. But here, notice that, she has this very fascinating, just 4 lines. She says, it's Olympian Zeus himself who hands our fortunes out to each of us in turn, to the good and bad. However Zeus prefers, he gave you pain. It seems you simply have to bear it. 2 things occur to me about that. One is that isn't that basically his name? Odysseus, the one who suffers, right? It's another play off of his name and his unfortunate vocation in the mind of Zeus. And 2, it's a fascinating statement by Nausicaa when you compare it to Zeus's opening of the entire the entire Odyssey, where he basically says, "Oh, look at all these mortals that keep blaming us for all of their bad fortune. Look, it's their own decisions, it's their own agency. They make their own mistakes." And here, I think what Nausicaa says is very much the type of fate that we received in the Iliad, right?
I think it's interesting because in the one you have Homer putting into the mind of the god, right? That I say putting into the mind of God, rather putting into the mouth of the god, right? So Homer's Zeus says it's all the mortal's fault. Here we have a mortal saying it's all the god's fault. And I think that's an interesting an interesting touch point. I think that's something that's we see very common in various mythologies. I think it's a very common thing we see in our own culture when things go poorly. Like people will blame God for it, or curse some kind of fate or something like that. I think whenever we're faced with insurmountable circumstances, there's a tendency to try to not beat ourselves up too bad about it if we can blame something else that helps us cope with it a little bit better. But
well, speaking of the Iliad too, the other thing that stood out to me about her and the uniqueness of her island is that we're not quite sure yet. I think it will be told to us maybe, I think, in book 7, but this island has a very intimate relationship to the gods. And so she has a line down around 220 or so, I think it is.
215.
Yeah, she says a little after 220.
Oh, no, it is 220, yeah.
Yeah, she says, basically she says, like, listen, we're here. Like, there's no one alive. There never will be, who would reach Phaeacian soil and lay it waste. The immortals love us too much for that. I mean, I don't know about you all, but I just laughed and underlined it, and to the side just wrote Troy.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I mean, but it's interesting because Nausicaa does seem to be giving a very Troy or Iliad-based understanding of fate in this passage, right? Troy was the city most loved by Zeus, and that didn't stop it. So it's just a side note, but I just think that as she kind of expresses, maybe what we would dare to say even an adolescent understanding of fate and free will in the Homeric, concept. Her just saying like, oh, listen, our island city-state, our polis is so loved by the gods it will stand forever. Yeah, have you not heard the bards sing
news,
about Troy? Right? Like, so okay, let's get to the bathing. Let's get to the bathing scene. So Odysseus is covered in grime. He's a terrible sight, and he's also just standing there with a branch over himself. So they lay out these clothes, and basically there's an offer for, I don't believe it's Nausicaa, but her handmaids to wash him, which seems to be an incredibly normative Greek practice. We already mentioned this with Telemachus. We see this in several other occasions, right? There's this bathing. It's also part of that guest friendship, right? It's a natural part of that, of the bathing, the clothing, the feeding, this just like robust, thick understanding of hospitality. But he says around 240, he declines. He doesn't decline the bath, but he declines to bathe even in front of them or to have the girls help him. He says, I won't bathe in front of you. I would be embarrassed, stark naked before young girls with lovely braids. Okay, so on the level of Odyssean rhetoric, I'm not sure anyone actually takes this, that he is actually going to be embarrassed to bathe in front of the young girls. I could be wrong about that. I don't see this being on its face. So then I think, why does he do this? Why would he do this? A few things occur to me. One is maybe that temptation is there, and he's putting more space. He's putting more of a distance between that temptation and the reality of just not being bathed, etc. By the women. The other one that occurs to me, and I don't know all the ins and outs of the culture, but the thing that occurs to me is that, and maybe Eli, this ties well with your theme of like, where's the king or where's the man, or is it the man of the household that can give this permission for the woman to bathe the man? It seems interesting here that there's that male presence on Nausicaa's side is missing, and I don't know whether or not like she has the authority to have the women bathe him, or even if she does, maybe this is a third take, even if she does have that authority, is it wise for him to do that? Because what if a male authority shows up? And here's a naked stranger getting bathed by all the women, which includes the princess, apparently just standing there watching it happen. You're a first-time reader. I mean, does this catch you as weird at all? Or, like, the Greeks usually don't talk about being embarrassed.
Yeah, here's my take, and this is probably off, okay? But this was just my raw take, right? So he had this internal monologue just not too long ago, and he had to say, take courage, and he had to stand back up and, like, pick himself up by the bootstraps. And then he also had to have Nausicaa say hey, suck it up, buttercup, like, let's go, move forward, keep going, yeah, you've had it hard, like, but that's just the reality of it. And so you see this like bell curve that kind of goes up and down in the in Odysseus's like just how he's perceiving reality, I guess, of like things. Oh, woe is me. Oh, nope, I need to keep going. Oh, woe is me. Then you have somebody else telling him, nope, you need to keep going. And then he does what I thought, like, just from a very flat level read of like, nope, it's more prudent for me to just bathe myself, even if that would be the case of it being normal for the girls to bathing. I'm going to do it myself since I'm new here. And then what happens is he comes back out and is rewarded by the gods, mainly Athena, who just like really pumps him up to make him look like a stud, And so to me, I just saw this as just kind of a I don't want to say character development, but like a way in which Odysseus was finally kind of rewarded for like, yeah, I have to keep moving forward.
Yeah, I like that. I think there's something there.
I think another element of it too is back to what Deacon was saying. Nausicaa doesn't buy his excuse like, "Oh, I would be embarrassed." Like, you just showed us how cultured you were, right? Like, right. And this is part of culture. So I don't think that Nausicaa would buy that excuse. But I think again, kind of going back to, I think the third thing that you said there, Deacon, is it wise for him to do it in case, say, the king does show up? How is this going to get explained? I think that Odysseus is very sensitive to how precarious his position kind of is here. Even after he's showed the girls or convinced Nausicaa, at least, that he's not a threat, I think he's still very concerned about preserving that appearance of I'll do it myself. Like, I don't want you to feel uncomfortable at all here. Like, I think this is another thing about guest friendship. And I'm not sure how much you've discussed it, but guest friendship requires reciprocity. And I think that Odysseus has nothing to give. Odysseus has no gifts to give his hosts, right? The hosts usually give gifts to their guest, but guests also bring their host gifts. He doesn't have any gifts. So what is the gift he's giving them? It's this sense of security. It's this, I'm going to spare you the labor, almost. Like, I think there's a lot of different layers to his decision to bathe himself here. But you're right that it is a stark departure from what would be normative in this society.
It also really strikes me, the thing about the Odyssey that strikes me more than the Iliad is actually just the abundance of female characters. Mm-hmm. And in this scene in which you have like a Greek hero being so deferential and careful in his mannerisms towards a woman, I think is something unique. There's nothing that really occurs to me in the Iliad that matches that level. There's a commentary, Fagles mentions it in his brief commentary in the back of the book, that mentions that this was Odysseus shows himself to be the first gentleman in Europe. Right, he's the first gentleman in Europe, which I think is obviously there's a certain read there, but there's also a charm to that, I think. But yeah, it's a fascinating passage, and it's one that I think you can really gloss over. Like, why do I care about whether or not he gets bathed or not? Right?
Yeah, like we bathe ourselves all the time, right?
Like poor Odysseus, he had to bathe himself. Okay. So let's jump to, I want to point out one more thing she says kind of in this back and forth before we get to trying to her kind of the prudently lay out how are they going to get back to the city. So around 270, this is where we get another marriage touch point. This is where she says, so he's dressed, he looks good. Athena has, put this glow upon him, talks about his curls are doing great, right? He looks taller, he looks stronger. And she says, at first he seemed appalling, I must say. Now he seems like a god who rules the skies up there. Ah, if only a man like that were called my husband, lived right here, pleased to stay forever. So you almost get the tables have turned, right? So now she's comparing him to a god, and we get the marriage theme again.
But I mean, also, like I said before, it has to do with Athena hooking him up, making him look bigger, taller, stronger. Like, it was not just, it was like it wasn't like all of a sudden she just realized, oh, I just missed this. I just kind of missed these attributes to make him look like a god. Like,
I mean, it's great that Athena is just such a wingman to Odysseus here. It's like,
Yeah.
like, how did he buy this girl off? Like, Athena's just doing everything for Odysseus here.
So we get this. So Eli, I want to touch on something that you mentioned earlier, because the last kind of chunk of this book, where she kind of shows, hey, you can't walk with us. If you walk with us, there's going to be a lot of scandal, because everyone's going to wonder like who you are, who's the stranger with the beautiful princess. We also kind of get more context of the island that they're not entirely welcoming of strangers. I think there's a tension in that guest friendship, which I think comes out a little bit more in book 7. And so, she says she's kind of orchestrating this political deal and saying, listen, okay, we're going to go first, but you have to walk by yourself. You stay here in the sacred grove. And then she tells him, like, not only how to enter the city, but then also, like, what he needs to do according to his plight. You got to go and throw yourself at the knees of the queen mother, right? Or her mother. You got to go throw your knees at Queen Arete. That's what you have to do. And this is the passage, Eli, what you said earlier, and this is what I actually wrote in my book. This is the passage that I realized, oh, she's like a young Penelope. Like, not only because she had the rhetoric, like, I know we had the beauty, we had the rhetoric, but here we actually get, she's not just wit and banter, right? She's just not the surface level wit and banter. This is like, no, I actually know the political machinations. I have the imaginative capacity to understand how things will seem in the decisions I make and how they affect other people. And so this is how we need to do this, right? She's telling the mastermind like Zeus, Odysseus, how we need to prudently and craftily enter the city. And this is where I wrote, yes, she is the young Penelope. She is that crafty female presence.
Well, I like what you said there, like that she is the mastermind guiding Odysseus, telling him how to enter the city, which is exactly what Odysseus did back at Troy. He is the mastermind that said, here is exactly what you need to do to enter this city and take its spoils. And in this case, right, it's Odysseus isn't going to take over this civilization that he's found in sense, because they're suspicious of strangers, not that they're unhospitable, right? We've seen Nausicaa say, like, no, I'm going to show you this hospitality. She says that you need to go to my mother to receive hospitality. Like you can still get it, but you need to know the power dynamics that are going on here. But then she also just says, yeah, like we're seafaring folk, and we don't take lightly to strangers here. And it's kind of interesting. I think you're correct, though. But the way that you said it just now just clicked in my mind that, oh, she is an Odysseus that is telling Odysseus how to conquer this city with words, and who to go and speak to, and how to enter the city, so that he won't be accosted or he won't be led astray or anything like that.
I like that parallel. I like it. I have to think more about it, but I like it.
Another interesting thing here. This is, I don't know how I feel about Nausicaa. I mean, obviously she gives him all of these instructions, right? Like, you'll ride with us on the wagon a certain way, but then we're gonna stop and you're gonna get off, and then we're gonna go on, and then you're gonna come in after us, but not with us, kind of thing, because you're trying to, you don't want to give this scandal, this sort of thing. But in the conversation on scandal, she really kind of takes a moment to dwell on this scandal and like what exactly it looks like. And it's interesting to me. So she says here, kind of like line 299, I shrink from all of our sea dogs' nasty gossip. Some old salt might mock us behind our backs. We have our share of insolent types in town. One of the coarser sort spying us might say, now who's that tall, handsome stranger Nausicaa has in tow? Where did she light on him? Her husband-to-be just wait. But who, some shipwrecked stray she's taken up with, some alien from abroad? Since nobody leaves nearby, unless it's really a god who come down from the blue to answer all her prayers and to have her all his days. Good riddance. Let the girl go roving to find herself a man from foreign parts. She only spurns her own, countless Phaeacians round about who court her, nothing but our best. So they'll scoff. Just think of the scandal that would face me then. I would find fault with this girl who carried on that way. No, stranger, listen closely to what I say, and then she kind of goes on. But she spends a fair paragraph here, detailing exactly what these slanderers would have to say. And, Odysseus is already sensitive to this, so why is she taking the time to dwell on what scandal might erupt? But what is she giving him here? She says, who is that tall, handsome stranger? Why does she have to include the detail that he's handsome? She includes, this suggestion, her husband-to-be, just wait. Nobody lives nearby. She spurns all of her suitors. She wants someone from abroad. She doesn't want to marry anyone locally because she's not interested in them. It's just fascinating to me that she would include this much detail on something that Odysseus is already intelligent enough to pick up on. And then the other thing that she adds at the very bottom, she says, again, right, just think of the scandal. I would blame a girl that did all of these things. Mm-hmm. And I think reading between the lines here, maybe what she's trying to communicate is precisely that. She is attracted to him. She thinks he's handsome. She is not interested in any of the suitors that have, or any of the Phaeacians that she's aware that her father might try to arrange a marriage with. She says, he must be some kind of a god if he dropped out of the sky like that, or a foreigner and good riddance, she'll do that because she doesn't like any of us anyway. She's kind of just put it out there. Hey, I think you're attractive, and I'm of a marriageable age, and I don't like anyone here. And then she backs off and says, but of course I would blame a girl that tried to orchestrate all of these things herself. And so by putting it that way, she has, in a way, given Odysseus a marriage proposal by saying, I'm attracted to you and I don't like anyone here, and I would probably like it if you were my husband. But of course, it would be scandalous if I were to try to arrange this for myself. So she basically tells him, go and ask my parents. She's just basically having this conversation with them and says, here's what you need to do to get in the city. Here's who you need to go and talk to. Let me introduce you to my mom. If you're interested, you can go ahead and do this. The other interesting bit of this is that the way that she frames it, Odysseus doesn't have to take her up on the offer because she hasn't made it. She hasn't given him an offer. She hasn't come out and said, I have these feelings for you and I'm interested in pursuing marriage or anything like that. All she said is exactly what she wouldn't do, namely try to arrange her own marriage outside of her parents' wishes by going down and doing the laundry and meeting some stranger from some foreign land. So again, I think this just goes back to rhetoric. And again, I think this amplifies the temptation for Odysseus precisely because she is so good at, as you said, Deacon, and I think you said very pointedly, weaving this sort of speech in which she makes it very clear what is going on with her marriage or, the potential for her marriage, while also making very clear her wishes, while also giving Odysseus all the plausible deniability he needs to not have to take her up on that offer.
Yeah, that's a heck of an arc on the...
yeah.
It's a heck of an arc.
On a paragraph, right. I know.
No. I don't... here's the thing. So in defense of what you said, when you have these two people, so let's just say that she is a young Penelope. So you have a mastermind like Zeus, and you have someone who reminds us of a young queen of matchless cunning. When you're with a person like that, how obvious do you have to be about things? Not obvious, right? You can drop things. I think there's a real feminine wit here, particularly of using the hypothetical third person, right, and talking about things in the hypothetical to imply something to Odysseus that he probably already knows, but her doing it does show him something, right? It shows her willingness. The arc I was talking about, so I think you read a lot there. I think it's all reasonable given their level of rhetoric and what's going on. The arc that caught my attention was just simply that Odysseus also offers her this level of rhetoric, but we were starting off with the thesis of, I'm trying to mention Artemis so you know I'm not going to rape you. And we end the book with, Nausicaa being like, by the way, if you'd like to marry me, here's my implication on that. So, that's a lot of an arc, particularly on a book that one of the things that struck me about it is very short. It is 360 lines, right? I think we've extracted a lot from that. But there's 360 lines here. And that was one thing that kind of struck me when I first read it, because that's why I asked you to join us for both book 6 and 7. So what we're going to do is when we cover book 7 next week, because I really read them as one book, right? I really, this is a book I very much feel like we just drop off in the middle of the narrative, and then we have to pick up. So, okay, very good. Anything else? Any closing thoughts on book 6 before we kind of get into book 7 next week?
My only closing thought was like I think around like 350, 360 at the very end. I thought it was hilarious that and maybe this is a misread, so correct me if this is a misread, but I think it's funny that it seems like Odysseus thinks that Athena hasn't been hearing his prayers this whole time, even though she's been orchestrating this whole operation that's been happening. I just found that to be a little ironic.
You know, I underline that, Adam, because he says, "For you never heard me then." Mm-hmm. And I just put a question mark next to that because I wasn't quite sure, like, how can he think
that she'd not heard him
with everything that he's done? Now, granted, I mean, let's push back on ourselves here. Insofar as, like, we know a lot of what Athena's doing because of the Homeric narrative.
Right, but he doesn't.
I don't think Athena knows that, or excuse me, I don't think Odysseus knows that Athena has been the one serving as his interlocutor, his intermediary between Zeus, right? She was the one that basically got him off the island and also was helping his son, which he has no idea about. Mm-hmm. She helps him with the rocks so he doesn't crash himself against the rocks. I don't remember if he actually calls out to her or not. Later he'll retell the story and not mention her helping him. So I don't know. I'm trying to think about. No, in book 7 though, it seems explicitly that he should know that Athena is helping him. But I'm actually.
Athena helps him put him to sleep at the end. Like when she finally gets there, she's like, "Finally, just sleep." You know, right. He goes to sleep. I mean, she makes him look like a stud. In this book, like all these things in which Athena is constantly helping Odysseus throughout the book thus far, and yet Odysseus is concerned that she hasn't been hearing his prayers.
I think there's something human about that in a way. I mean, you know, when you're going through a rough time and all you're seeing is all the terrible things that have happened to you, I think it's very easy. But there's also a very real sense in which there's a mystery to the hiddenness, I guess you could say, of the gods and their machinations or fate, or, you know, that behind the scenes, the universe is somehow orchestrating something incredible that you can't possibly know. Mm-hmm. All you know is what's right in front of you, which is, in Odysseus's case, his misery and his troubles, and
But she does hear his prayers, and it even says that at the end, right? That she is hearing his prayers, and you know, that he's just not going to be. It's just undisguised right now.
What's even almost more amazing about this is that it doesn't merit from her some type of chastisement, because Athena is quite quick to chastise, right? We've seen this already, right, with Telemachus, where he's like, "Oh, Athena would never help me," and Athena's there as mentor, but basically chastises him, and then that's probably what also precipitates her turning into a bird, right, an eagle, and soaring away, just as kind of a slam dunk on, "By the way, you idiots, like, it's me." I'm not sure Odysseus has had that moment yet, but also, coming off the Iliad, you just think, like, brother, like, Athena literally is helping you at every turn. You're literally famous for this.
Yes, but 10 years have passed since Troy fell. Like, that's the other thing. Like, he has had, and again, back to Adam's point, we don't know, or Odysseus doesn't know, that Athena's the one that got Calypso to release him. He has just had no contact with the gods, and I'm sure he's probably prayed to Athena for however long on Calypso's island, and, you know, he just has not been able to go. He has not been able to see the day of his homecoming. So I think Odysseus's reaction is somewhat natural, and that his perception that Athena has kind of abandoned him is, if not entirely understandable, which I think it is, it's very relatable, I think, for many of us whenever we're kind of confronted with hardship after hardship after hardship, as Odysseus has been.
Yeah. No, I think that's very good. Well, Eli, we deeply appreciate you being here this week and helping us guide us through book 6 with Nausicaa. No, you'll join us again next week for book 7, and we'll kind of round off this narrative.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I hope Deacon, maybe you've had a little bit more of an appreciation for the kind of charm that I've found in this particular book.
You're a guiding light. You're a mentor. I appreciate it.
Go check us out on thegreatbookspodcast.com. We'll see you guys next week.